Well, welcome everyone on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm M. Christian Green at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. I'm a proud alumna of our Law and Religion program at the CSLR, as we call it. And I have boomeranged back to the CSLR for another phase of my career, where I'm currently serving as executive editor of Canopy Forum, our digital publication that is sponsoring this webinar today. I am also a co-editor and the symposium and book review editor for the Journal of Law and Religion. So I kind of specialize in bringing groups of people around to talk about different aspects of law and religion. And I'm delighted to have this group today to talk to us about law, religion, and immigration. Let me tell you who we've got on the webinar with us. First, we have Brian M. Elrod. Dr. Elrod joined the Wake Forest University community in 2022 as a postdoctoral fellow in the program for leadership and character. Since 2023, he has served as the university's director of pre-law studies. He is currently developing courses, advising, and co-curricular programming that will cultivate excellences of character and mind necessary to equip students for their pursuit in justice-seeking professions and to infuse their work with the ideal of pro humanitate. We'll have to hear more about that. His current book project is entitled Can These Bones Live? A Political Theology for the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, and it takes up questions of border enforcement in a regime known as prevention through deterrence. Dr. Laura Alexander is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Executive Director of the Goldstein Center for Human Rights at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She's a scholar of religious ethics with research expertise in religion and human rights, immigration and migration studies, the tradition of just war thought, national borders in the state, and religious freedom and humanitarian aid. She has a wonderful book, or had a wonderful book out in 2023 from Routledge called Religion and Human Rights: An Introduction, which I can highly recommend. And her work, in addition to research and teaching, involves quite a bit of community involvement, which she'll be speaking to us about today. Liz Reiner Platt is director of the Rights and Religion Project, LRRP, where she's been since 2015. The project was founded in 2014 under another name, but in 2025 it joined the Union Theological Seminary under its current name. Uh, Before joining LRP, Liz was a staff attorney doing legal services, mental health law. She has written for numerous publications and has been cited as an expert in law and religion in the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Associated Press. Under Liz's leadership, LRRP has become a nationally recognized thought leader on the meaning, purpose, and protection of religious freedom. So without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Brian Elrod.
I want to thank the Canopy Forum for the chance to be a part of the webinar. As a non-lawyer, I covet the time I get to spend learning from fellow religious ethicists like Professor Alexander, and then from proper lawyers like Professor Platt. Um, Moreover, I think the topic of today's conversation gave me an opportunity to work through some of my anxieties regarding the measure of political agency that the law yet affords to religious actors and organizations who believe themselves to be called to meet the sojourner with compassion rather than contempt. And so that's where the energy of my paper lies. So I take as my point of departure an insight from Robert Cover's essay Nomos and Narrative. A world of law, Cover proposes, is more than an assemblage of codified rules. It's one of the languages by which we narrate the unredeemed character of reality as we know it, and the fundamentally different reality that should take its place. Where the question of redemption is concerned, then legal controversies do more than alleviate ambiguities in the positive law. They reveal a reckoning between contending futures. Today, the Trump administration presents us with a vision of reality in which the names citizen and alien efface the shared humanity that lies beneath them. Now, this vision is not novel, nor is the concomitant vision of redemption that's premised on exclusion. From the term's first appearance in the common law, alien has signified a character divided by her loyalties to different sovereigns, and at critical turns, the suspicion that these divided loyalties inspire has turned to enmity. Such was the case in Justice Stephen Field's landmark ruling in Che Chun-ping v. United States, which cast Chinese aliens as racial outsiders, prosecuting a cultural invasion of the US. Allowing that invaders don't always arrive armed and uniformed, Field's ruling identified alienage itself, conceived principally in terms of racial difference, with enmity. Further, Field's identification of the sovereign's duty and right to repel such existential threats laid the groundwork for the plenary power doctrine. So in Trump's second administration, no less than in 1889, the name alien is suffused with enmity, and moreover, the connotations of racial difference have once again come to the fore. In a recent opinion, Justice Kavanaugh includes apparent race or ethnicity and speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent as reasonable grounds of suspicion for enforcement actions. However, reasonable suspicions of this sort have led to the extended detention and removal of aliens lawfully present within the United States, as well as US citizens. And these incidents make the name alien, I think, into a cancerous legal figure that metastasizes and threatens to make race the grounds for identifying friends and enemies. However, as this cancer spreads to the body politic, I try to argue religious organizations yet possess distinct opportunities to slow the contagion. First, as story-shaped communities, religious organizations are well-resourced to provide counter-narratives about migrants and citizens that emphasize compassion over enmity. And second, I argue that under the protections afforded by the First Amendment and Religious Freedom Restoration Act, religious organizations possess an opportunity to make their sanctuaries and houses of worship zones of exception wherein these narratives may become more effective. Now, between narrative and nomos, then, religious organizations may yet play a role in welcoming migrants into an otherwise hostile community, not merely through sectarian withdrawal, but open legal contest. So, in pursuit of a salutary counter-narrative, I focus on the ger, a figure drawn from the Jewish and Christian scriptures that appears 92 times in the Hebrew Bible and typically is translated as alien or sojourner. Certainly, the ger is an outsider. She may be a racial other. Crucially, however, her alterity, her difference, does not necessitate suspicion or enmity. Rather, her presence in the community discloses their participation in a common human condition that transcends insider-outsider distinctions. So whether in the tales of the fathers and mothers of the faith, or of the people's exiles in Egypt or Babylon, or of their wanderings in the wilderness, the Hebrew Bible is a story about sojourners, and thus in Genesis and Exodus, the term ger is applied to heroes of the faith. In the Chronicles and the Psalms, it's used as an inclusive term to capture the transience and contingency, that characterizes all human beings. So in First Chronicles, we read, "We are strangers before thee and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are all like a shadow, and there is no abiding." In the Psalms, we read, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not thy peace in my tears, for I am thy passing guest, a sojourner like all my fathers." These passages make explicit, I think, what is implicit throughout the Hebrew Bible. The sojourner, the people of God, and all humanity are bound together. And the vision of humanity that emerges within these bonds is one in which crossing and not dwelling, transience and not permanence, contingency and not security are the norm. Rather than meeting these facts with contempt, the Hebrew Bible makes them the basis for justice and compassion. Thus, the people's treatment of the sojourner, along with the widow and the orphan, sets the paradigm for righteousness and unrighteousness. If there is to be any differential treatment, it must be to achieve equity for those who, by virtue of their outsider status, face the precarities of landlessness and disinheritance. And all of this, I think, is crystallized in the love commandment that appears in Leviticus 19:34, where we read, "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." To be human is to be a sojourner on the earth. God's chosen people are no exception. For them, this status is an historical and anthropological fact. To oppress the sojourner, then, on the grounds of her racial difference, would amount to a failure of collective memory that dehumanizes sojourner and citizen alike. So I think that religious communities that are bearers of this literary inheritance are distinctly well positioned to tell a more humane story about migrants. Moreover, recent legal battles in the US-Mexico borderlands suggest that law may yet protect interventions that would bring this counter-narrative to bear against the US immigration regime's most dehumanizing effects. Arizona professor and humanitarian Scott D. Warren has proven the promise of such strategies on multiple occasions. In 2019, after being arrested for providing food, water, and shelter to two men unlawfully present in the country, Warren lodged a successful RFRA defense to ward off felony charges of conspiracy and criminal alien harboring. In the same year, he won a second case using the same defense, and this time in response to littering charges assessed for stashing water reserves on migrant trails in the western Sonoran Desert. Legal victories, like Warren's, may not portend substantive changes to immigration statutes. Nevertheless, I think they suggest a strategy for making religious actors' rights of conscience shields against the advance of government power. The legal effort underway in New England Synod Evangelical Lutheran Church of America versus Department of Homeland Security, I think, extends this strategy further. Plaintiffs argue that DHS's revocation of the sensitive spaces policy undermines the free exercise of their faith, which requires, among other things, collective worship with all persons, regardless of nationality or immigration status. As in Warren's case, the plaintiffs appeal to RFRA and suggest that enforcement actions within their houses of worship will unduly burden their religious freedoms. However, by tying the integrity of their religious freedoms to the integrity of the sensitive spaces in which these freedoms are exercised, I think they introduced something novel, and they placed the shield which guarded Warren's conscience at the sanctuary doors instead. Thus, a victory for the plaintiffs promises to make houses of worship into zones of exception, where the federal government's sovereign power over the alien collides with the divine sovereign claim on the ger and is brought to a halt, or at least that's the gambit. Such results, I grant, are not redemption. They are only partial justices. They don't change the hostile legal terrain that aliens unlawfully present in the US must traverse. Nevertheless, they create way stations and shelters that declare the inhumanity of the present moment and testify that in the world to come, the relationship between citizens and migrants could and should be ordered otherwise. I think that's more or less the gist of the paper. So I'll leave it there, and thank you all for including me.
Thank you very much, Brian. And now we're going to move on to Laura Alexander, who will be speaking to us about economic and religious arguments around migration in conjunction with some of her important community work in Omaha, Nebraska. Laura.
Thank you. I'm going to share slides, so please give me just a moment to put my slides up. Okay, great. Christy, please let me know if you have any trouble seeing the slides, but I'll just move forward here. I appreciate you and again, the Canopy Forum, also Rachel and John for the invitation here and for the chance to think through these important topics in conversation with my fellow panelists and the audience. So I've chosen to focus my discussion on the question, we were kind of given several questions that we could address, and I chose the question, how do different religious, social, and civic organizations address immigration, whether through reform or activism? So to address that question, I'm going to be talking about a specific advocacy network in my own state of Nebraska that brings together religious organizations and other groups to advocate for, one, meaningful change to federal immigration policies that reflect the realities of contemporary immigration and our community and workforce needs. And two, state-level policies that welcome immigrants and allow immigrants to live and thrive in Nebraska communities in mutually supportive and productive ways. The main argument that I want to make has two components. So first, religious groups often can engage in more meaningful and sustained advocacy if they act in coalition with other organizations and leaders. And the Advocacy Network in Nebraska has done a good job of this. Second, however, when an advocacy group has multiple members with different, sometimes competing priorities, religious leaders and scholars ought to look carefully at how those priorities shape the rhetoric that the group uses to describe immigrants and what they bring to their host communities. It's important for religious groups to emphasize and control their own narratives about migrants while cooperating as much as possible with other organizations in their endeavors. So I'll tell you a little bit about this advocacy group that has formed here in Nebraska. Its name is the Nebraska Alliance for Thriving Communities, or NATC. Within this alliance, religious communities and leaders work together with immigrant leaders and advocates, business leaders, labor organizers, and nonprofit organizations to promote welcome for immigrants and to recognize their contributions to Nebraska communities. NATC specifically advocates with Nebraska's federal congressional cohort, so our 2 U.S. senators and then our 3 members of the House of Representatives. And the goal is to push these politicians to be open to, maybe even sponsor, legislation that would bring U.S. immigration law into the 21st century. NATC has also talked with state-level senators about the importance of Nebraska's policies that can help immigrant families to live full, dignified lives and engage fruitfully in their work and education. Example of policies at the statewide level that the group supports include expanding unemployment insurance benefits to immigrants with work permits, and making sure that immigrants aren't discriminated against when they try to get a driver's license because of confusion about their eligibility. And I have to tell you, anywhere in Nebraska, even Omaha, which is the largest city where I live, you have to have a car. There's kind of no way to really live your full life without a car. So having a car and a driver's license is really important, which is why this is one of these policies that the group has pushed for. NATC, so this advocacy coalition I'm talking about, was brought together by an organization called Omaha Together One Community, or OTOC. And OTOC is the Nebraska affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which historically has worked closely with religious groups to build support and power to meet the needs of local communities. 15 out of 19 of OTOC's member organizations are religious. And many of these organizations are also part of the Nebraska Alliance for Thriving Communities. NATC definitely gives those religious groups a public platform so that they can explain the religious reasoning behind their commitments to just and humane treatment for immigrants. Having said that, talking about these religious communities, but when NATC members talk to politicians, and even when the media reports on their work, the focus really tends to be on economic and business concerns. Specifically, the conversation usually focuses on our admittedly urgent workforce needs in Nebraska. The business and labor leaders in the coalition emphasize the state's low unemployment rate, the jobs that we have that require manual labor, like agriculture and meatpacking, and an ongoing loss of younger people and families. In Nebraska, we also have the same concern with falling birth rates that many wealthy countries have. So we just simply don't have the students and young workers to do jobs that are needed. Our state economy really isn't able to function properly without immigrants. Again, we need workers and we need young families. So these are important points of discussion, and the economic angle is usually the ones that our politicians pay attention to. That's how they're able to get the politicians to come and sit on a stage and kind of listen to what's going on. I do have to say, even that angle has not been all that successful in the last year or two. So the politicians attend the events, they make some noises about how they understand that our businesses are hurting without available workers, then they talk about securing the border and basically go home. So even so, it's understandable that NATC would mostly focus on immigrants' contributions to economic vitality. But when advocates focus so much on the economic benefits of immigration, in the medium to long term, it can reinforce an idea that immigrants are just cogs in an economic machine. In the paraphrased words of Swiss writer Max Frisch, we asked for workers, we got human beings instead. Even though NATC is arguing for welcome and hospitality to immigrants, I think it's important that religious groups and other advocates who view immigration from a humanitarian perspective need to sound a cautionary note, because the human aspect of social issues can risk getting lost in the shuffle if you have so much emphasis on workforce and economic needs. So honestly, there's just some tension here between different ways of looking at immigrants, and that tension needs to be addressed over time, although it's possible it may not be able to be completely overcome. It might just be kind of part of what you get when you build a coalition like this. It's true that a group like NATC really does have more political and social power when it has labor leaders, business leaders, and others in the same room alongside the religious groups and immigrant leaders. On their own, the churches and nonprofits that form the backbone of OTOC and NATC just aren't going to get 2 US senators and 3 representatives to come to an event. But religious groups and other humanitarian organizations need to keep emphasizing that immigrants aren't just cogs to fit into workforce needs, but they are full human beings who deserve basic dignity and respect, whose contributions to the community go beyond their daily job. As my time runs out here, I do want to be clear that I'm not singling out NATC for being especially bad about this in any way. In my view, the business and labor leaders within the coalition do see immigrants as full human beings themselves from their personal perspective. Again, the business and the labor leaders will talk about the importance of keeping families together and talk about welcoming immigrant families in humane ways. And the religious and the nonprofit representatives in the group do certainly speak in public about human dignity, family bonds, and community values. But again, there are tensions that come along with building these coalitions with different members. Despite the fact that OTOC's membership is so heavily religious, the announcement of this advocacy coalition that OTOC put on its own website uses about 90% of its space to talk about economic needs versus only about probably 10% for humanitarian or other concerns. So again, we see that kind of creep of that narrative. So my main point in this discussion is just that it's important for scholars to examine how immigrants are portrayed when religious groups join with others to enhance their advocacy. Coalitions can strengthen the voices of religious advocates for sure, but they also risk diluting some of that religious messaging. And again, not to say that cooperation is bad, quite the opposite. I am in support of the existence of NATC and what it does. But I do think for religious groups in particular, it becomes important to keep pushing the message of immigrants' own humanity and dignity alongside the economic and other contributions that immigrants make to American life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And now we move on to Liz Reiner-Platt, who will speak to us in part from a wonderful study that her organization has recently done about religious liberty litigation around immigration assistance and rights. Liz.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this incredibly timely event. And, as was just mentioned, I was invited to speak today about a report that the Law, Rights, and Religion Project just published on the use of religious liberty claims to challenge immigration-related laws, both in the past and today. The report is less academic and really intended as more of a practical research and analytical tool to help educate people, whether they be attorneys currently practicing in the fields of immigration, criminal defense, or civil rights, or faith communities themselves, to get a sense of how these kinds of religious liberty claims have been made in just a really wide swath of different contexts and postures, how they've fared in court, and looking forward, how courts might analyze future claims at this intersection of religious freedom and immigration, particularly in light of the dramatic expansion of free exercise rights by the Supreme Court in recent years. So the report is almost 70 pages long, so I'm only going to be able to discuss a small fraction of the claims that it covers. So what I'm going to do is take you through just, again, a small handful of claims from the report and end with a few kind of key takeaways and questions that I've been wrestling with on how those recent Supreme Court cases might have implications in the immigration context. Given that this is a Canopy Forum event, I'm going to go ahead and assume that many of the folks watching have at least a basic, if not a quite sophisticated understanding of U.S. religion law, so I can't really spend too much time on that. but I'll say that these cases covered in the report have been brought under a range of different constitutional and statutory bases, including the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, that was mentioned previously, the Free Exercise Clause, a few state RFRA cases, and on occasion the Establishment Clause as well. The whole first half of our report covers claims brought by migrants themselves as part of the immigration process. So this covers claims such as migrants requesting religious accommodations in immigration detention. So, cases requesting access to religious food or garb in detention. And I'll note that the DOJ itself quite rightfully acknowledges that even privately run detention centers do have to comply with RFRA. Migrants have also brought successful RFRA claims to gain exemptions related to filing applications for permanent residence or citizenship. These are things like relief from having to submit to blood draws or to share photographs of themselves as part of an application if doing so would violate their faith. Interestingly, in one of these cases, then Attorney General John Ashcroft actually issued an opinion stating that immigration judges and the Board of Immigration Appeals are, quote, subject to the provisions of RFRA when interpreting and applying immigration law. Despite that opinion from AG Ashcroft, I will say that in practice, I'm told that these administrative judges kind of don't know what to do with and frequently ignore RFRA claims. And so often attorneys may include them in the immigration system, really just to set up future litigation in federal court. A very few people have brought claims arguing for a religious liberty right not to be deported or not to have their family members deported. It's not something that's been tried a ton, and I have yet to find a full judicial opinion actually analyzing this claim. But during Trump 1, a U.S. citizen, wife and daughter of an undocumented immigrant, brought a claim arguing that his deportation violated their religious rights. As Seventh-day Adventists, they argued that family unity was essential to their religious practice and that deporting their husband and father to El Salvador would infringe on this religious practice. Again, the court didn't rule on the claim, but ICE did agree but the government did agree to allow him to stay in the country and pursue an asylum claim. There have also been religious liberty challenges to deportation brought by immigrant faith leaders. Again, none resulting in a substantive legal analysis. And I've heard some recent increased interest in this kind of argument as a supplement to religious asylum claims, particularly given the administration's increased willingness to aggressively pursue the deportation of asylum seekers at risk of religious persecution in their countries of origin. In addition, there have been religious liberty challenges to third country detention, to civil fines levied against women living in sanctuary churches, to the right of DACA recipients to attend a family funeral abroad and then be able to return to the United States, to the targeted questioning of Muslims, including citizens, at the border by immigration officials, and many other claims in the report. The whole second half of the report, which I really won't have time to get into, unfortunately, covers claims involving faith leaders and communities arguing for a religious right to serve, employ, or worship with migrants without fear of government persecution or harassment. Some of the most well-known cases discussed in this section are some of those successful no more deaths claims that were discussed by Dr. Elrod, involving humanitarian actors who were federally prosecuted for leaving food and water in the desert and got some of those charges dismissed under RFRA. But it also includes a whole host of other cases that you might not have heard of. So how have these cases fared? Truthfully, there's not a ton to go on. Many of these claims remain pretty untested, with just a couple cases in each section. So I don't want to overstate anything necessarily or come off as Pollyannish, but I will say that there have been some early and very important wins, including those no more deaths cases, and a couple new and ongoing cases that have been initially successful. And other cases discussed in the report have settled favorably. I want to also mention that in some of the cases that either didn't result in any legal opinion on RFRA, or even where the RFRA claim or religion claim was unsuccessful, I did notice a pattern of some hesitancy to harshly punish religious actors practicing their faith. So there are a handful of cases in the report where claimants, again, either didn't have their claims analyzed or even lost their religious liberty arguments, and then received noticeably and unusually light sentences. Again, certainly not something I'd want to overstate or give any sort of false sense of protection, but it was kind of a pattern that I saw in a handful of cases. And then finally, I'll mention that nearly every term for quite a while now, SCOTUS has been expanding religious liberty rights. So we don't entirely know yet if or how some of these newer cases, including Tandon v. Newsom, Masterpiece Cake Shop, Catholic Charities v. Wisconsin, Fulton, and many others, will impact immigration cases. But I do have some questions about this. So for example, in the Hobby Lobby case, the Supreme Court said that a religious exemption in the Affordable Care Act that was crafted quite narrowly to apply to houses of worship needed to be expanded to cover for-profit companies. Under the same analysis, might the existing religious exemption in the federal harboring statute, which criminalizes harboring illegal aliens, and that has a religious exemption that was crafted to protect the Church of Latter-day Saints' work with undocumented missionaries, could that be expanded more broadly to cover, for example, sanctuary churches under that Hobby Lobby analysis? In several recent cases, the Supreme Court has said that where a law has an existing secular exemption or a system of individualized assessments, then you have to permit religious exemptions from that law or policy as well. Well, immigration law is absolutely chock full of secular exemptions and individualized assessments. It's a pretty labyrinthian system of law. So given that, how will courts respond to requests for religious exemptions from immigration law? Last term in Catholic Charities v. Wisconsin, the court said it was unconstitutional for states to distinguish between religious organizations based on, quote, inherently religious choices, such as whether or not they proselytize. Could this principle be used to challenge, for example, regulations on how religious worker visas are issued? Could you say that the existing limits on religious worker visas are improperly based on, quote, inherently religious choices of religious organizations? We have also seen a ton of lawsuits over the past few years brought by religious nonprofits challenging certain terms of government contracts that they don't like, particularly non-discrimination requirements. Are we going to see any similar challenges from government grantees now that the Trump administration is placing very different kinds of requirements on the use of federal funds, including anti-DEI or anti-immigrant language? So I do have to stop there, and I know that was a lot, but I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to please read and share the full report, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I see we do have some questions already populating in the question and answer panel. So just want to encourage everyone in our audience to formulate your questions, and you can submit them there. I also, in my capacity as moderator, agreed to seed the discussion and foster a little discussion amidst our panelists with some questions specifically to their papers. So there was a section of Brian's paper that I don't think he read aloud that I just loved, which goes like this. The story of migration is not a story of invasion and defense, haunted by the specter of ineliminable enmity. Rather, it is a story of humanity's reckoning with the transience and contingency definitive of its condition as a finite, interdependent creature. The encounter with the neighbor is at once an opportunity to be reconciled to the other and to ourselves, perhaps even to the divine other. So the question that I wanted to hear Brian say something about a bit is for those who are still bothered by immigration and wondering who are these people coming into their communities and do they need to assimilate and be like us? Is assimilation the goal of immigration? Was it that way before? Is it still that way? What are the ways theologically, practically, ethically for overcoming that? And we might want to hear something from Laura on that a bit too, because she mentioned the sort of multiple factors that go into people's perceptions of immigrants. So, Brian first.
I think I hear this question two ways, one occurring kind of at the meta level and one much more on the ground if I think about my experience coming from a pretty plural neighborhood in Tampa, Florida. So I think in the abstract, I wonder, is part of what we're concerned about with assimilation, our capacity to engage in something like collective self-determination, our ability as a community not just to decide what we will do, but who we will be. And I think in that latter sense, I can appreciate how there's a concern to see folks assimilate, why there's a worry about seeing ourselves sort of change, that we would lose a kind of autonomy that we understand as critical to our political self-understanding. On the flip side, in response to this kind of concern, I'd suggest that our identity is always being formulated in response to our encounter with another. That we never are really completely autonomous. And here I think I'm just restating my kind of theological anthropological commitments, right? That humans are interdependent creatures, and that our self-understanding is formed not in the nominative, I say who I am, but in the accusative, I discover who I am when I encounter someone else. And in that respect, I think assimilation, if it involves sort of whoever is joining the community becoming like me, both potentially subjects that person to leaving behind crucial dimensions of themselves, but also actually kind of falsifies who I am and how I have become that person. Likewise, I think for our communities. On the more practical level, I can appreciate, living in a neighborhood where a bunch of us spoke different languages. There's just a question about, well, can we participate in life together without some measure of assimilation or the common practices of everyday life lost? And here I want to offer maybe a more measured or less abstract response, but to say, there's certain thick values that each of us might carry with us, certain specific practices that might occupy us. And here someone might not necessarily need to assimilate into these values, nor might I need to change them. But there probably is the necessity of committing to certain thin values. So I cite quite a bit in my paper Robert Cover's essay, Nomos and Narrative. And here he talks about, well, if you think of thick values like the religious values of the early and contemporary Jewish communities, where we might discuss that, reading the Torah, right, keeping the Sabbath, these are kind of thick values. But he suggests, after the temple has been destroyed and after we find ourselves in these more plural societies, thin values like justice, commitments to truth, if we can at least agree to argue about these things together, then that may be enough, and a full-scale assimilation likely isn't necessary. For me, growing up in Florida, is I speak, I think, what has at times been referred to as Spanglish, right? Like I can speak a little Spanish, it's not good, and my neighbor next door who I lived with could speak a little English, and we sort of work through it together kind of at this practical level. I think the practices of everyday life can proceed diachronically. It doesn't all need to happen at once. We can learn to live life together, and that will probably involve changes to our language, changes to some of the things we hold dear. But I think the promise born by these kinds of interactions is more important than what we might lose otherwise.
That's incredibly rich. And where I live in Louisiana, we occasionally hear, maybe not too much anymore, maybe we need to hear more of it, Cajun French, which is not exactly French, but is its own thing, but that very rich set of reflections. And so, Laura, I did want to ask you about those perceptions. And then the other question I had for you, which you kind of answered, but I wanted to add kind of a little twist on it. You mentioned that religious organizations tend to buy into or at least repeat the economic arguments. I wondered if it ever went the other way and business and labor organizations started speaking of if not specifically religious, moral or ethical arguments. So tell us about perceptions and business adopting religious language if it happens.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the most that I've found, again, this group that I was talking about as a whole, they will periodically use humanitarian language. So in that sense, the fact that the group does it, they have a statement of kind of principles that everyone has signed on to. And so when NATC speaks, you could say, well, the business and the labor leaders are speaking as well. When I was kind of poking around in what they've done most recently, most of what I found is about families. So I realize that's not only a religious language to have, but I haven't seen the group even recently use a lot of maybe what I would call humanitarian language of dignity or the need of people to be safe. There's some of that, but a lot of what they talk about is family togetherness. And again, I think this is strategic, right? Like I think they're using a language that I think will resonate in certain ways. So I think one other thing I'll say is a little bit of a tangent, but I was thinking about it when Dr. Elrod was speaking initially in his presentation was I have started to think that I need to do more work on rhetoric and propaganda in my intellectual scholarly work. Basically because I just end up hitting these kind of walls of frustration where you have a theological ethical perspective that Dr. Elrod is bringing out, and I've engaged with that myself. And that's sort of great. And that sometimes doesn't even make it into church communities, let alone kind of outside of them. So then how do you tell that narrative, right? Like how do you bring out that perspective? And when you do have religious communities that are talking in a humanitarian way, how do you overcome often actually, lies or untruths about migrants and migration, but also just keep that narrative more humane and more, as Brian said, kind of, recognizing some of the positive contributions that immigrations are making, some of the positives that come out of this sort of cultural mixing and change that we have. It seems like this is almost the worst time to be trying to do that. And so I think one thing that I just need to do more of, and I think maybe religious and humanitarian groups need to do more of, is to actually study propaganda and, for better or worse, to use some of those techniques themselves.
Interesting. So I've been in the chat, but trying to recruit Liz and successfully, I think, to say something about the sensitive spaces revocation, which Brian also mentioned in his paper. And I will say I actually heard mentioned even in my own church halls and questions about what to do. So tell us what that is. And then the other question I asked of Liz is, her organization is doing this very distinctive kind of progressive marshaling of religious liberty arguments, which heretofore have been often more on the traditional or conservative Christian side, and using it to make these arguments around all sorts of things, abortion rights, this immigration work. And so how do the religious arguments that they're making in the immigration sphere, how might those expand the doctrine of religious liberty more generally? So sensitive spaces and religious liberty. Tell us something, Liz.
Sure, yeah, I can kind of quickly give an overview of the sensitive locations issue. So, for the up until last January, for the prior 30 years, uh, there was a policy known as the sensitive locations policy that basically made it more difficult, though not impossible, for ICE to engage in immigration enforcement around certain locations that, as a society, we had thought should have some measure of protection, and namely hospitals, schools, houses of worship, religious ceremonies such as funerals, weddings, etc. That was revoked by President Trump on day one. And it was replaced with, I believe the language was that immigration enforcement agents should use common sense in engaging in enforcement in these areas. So not a lot to go on there, right? There are now 4 ongoing lawsuits. Dr. Elrod mentioned one of them, but there are 4 lawsuits challenging that revocation of the sensitive locations protection being brought by houses of worship. I believe there are additional suits also being done by hospitals and other sites, but I really know about the 4 on behalf of houses of worship. And we have initial decisions in 2 out of the 4 of those suits. And they came out different ways, interestingly enough, just on the issue, particularly on the issue of standing. So in one of the 4 cases, the court gave a preliminary injunction saying that, yes, houses of worship are at risk, and yes, immigration enforcement near them would probably violate their religious liberty rights. And so we're going to issue a preliminary injunction. That could all change. These are all really, I know law is so complicated, and this is just the initial stage, right? In the other case, they didn't issue a preliminary injunction, but the reporting on this was not great. It was not because they thought it wasn't a religion issue. It was because of standing. They said there is no clear risk that ICE is actually going to go enforce, do immigration enforcement at churches, and therefore you don't have standing to sue. Both of those, both the issuing of the PI and the rejection of the PI, are now on appeal. So sorry if that was more than you bargained for, but that's just kind of overview of the force of where we're at with sensitive locations. And then the other question you had, which I'm vamping, so I remember what it is. Okay, so it's whether these cases are going to expand religious exemptions. I mean, I would frame it more as like maybe they might kind of even out the playing field a tiny bit rather than expanding. I mean, we've already seen such a huge expansion such that things that, not too long ago, I think would be pretty clear violations of the Establishment Clause, like taking government funds, but then denying services to certain people because your religion doesn't approve of them. Like that would have been I think, Establishment Clause violation not too long ago. And now there are cases under which that is actually constitutionally required. So we've already seen an explosion of free exercise rights. So I don't know that I would say that these cases are necessarily doing any further work to expand it, but rather trying to clarify that, the exemptions don't necessarily shouldn't necessarily favor certain kind of theological or political communities.
Liz, can I ask a
Well,
question? And just to be,
yeah,
sorry,
go
if
ahead,
it's
Laura.
all right,
Go
just to
ahead.
be really blunt about it, I don't
Yeah.
think we've had a Supreme Court ruling yet that has answered the question of whether the current Supreme Court is willing to entertain religious freedom claims that ostensibly come from a politically progressive or liberal perspective versus those that come from an ostensibly politically conservative perspective. Would you say that's right? We don't have a ruling that would kind of help answer the question of whether there's going to be consistency?
I think the closest we've come to, and this is, it's not, I don't think it's even fair to call this progressive per se. It's just not Christian right, but some of the prison cases I would say might fall under that, for example, the right to wear a beard in prison. We might think of this as like a very conservative court when it comes to the criminal justice issues, right? They're highly deferential to law enforcement, maybe, and yet there has been a ruling saying that that incarcerated people have, upholding the right to religious accommodations in prison. So that's one example that comes to mind. But I think you're right in terms of this ones that might be like more obviously coded as politically liberal. I don't know that we've seen one of those cases yet. And I mean the Muslim ban also, that was an Establishment Clause case, but I think, that was, you can see a very dramatic difference in the way the Supreme Court handled the claim of religious discrimination in Masterpiece Cake Shop, involving the baker who didn't want to bake the cake for the same-sex wedding, and then, like I think a week later, a much, much lighter touch, shall we say, to claims of religious discrimination in the Muslim ban case.
So I see Liz is typing an answer to a question about Calvary, Albuquerque versus Rubio in the 10th Circuit. We'll let her finish that response and turn to a question directed to Brian. The question is, you mentioned extended detention and deportation. What is your take on the humanity aspect of those, and can they be addressed collaboratively with religion? Any thoughts specifically about detention and deportation in this moment?
I mean, so many, and I'm going to try to pull them together into something reflective and coherent. Y'all will judge. I think there are a number of things that worry me. Naturally, with kind of aggressive removals that strike me as, I think, advancing or producing a certain notion of nationhood. I think of perhaps nationhood premised on an Anglo European Christian heritage. These moves, I think, we're seeing people removed to settings where they face, I think reasonable, in my judgment, reasonable fear of persecution strike me as fundamentally inhumane, is undermining or setting aside the very goods that the Refugee Act exists, that the asylum system exists to preserve, and in that respect. So I think yes, I see kind of as a sort of an inhumanity in many of these moves. And I think one of the troubles in detention, and I think this is not just a matter of a kind of dehumanization through isolation, but where detention goes on for kind of, or could go on for indeterminate periods of time, right? This I think both produces a kind of isolation that dehumanizes, and also undermines, I think, presumptions perhaps about what we imagine due process ought entail. I think it also, though, underscores how due process rights are enjoyed perhaps differently, whether or not one's humanity comes to be articulated uh, through the language of citizenship or alienage. On all this, I'm going to look to my colleagues and those in the audience with JDs to correct me. I hope I've understood the question and offered a kind of good
Yeah.
response there.
Well, you mentioned fear, and that is so important. I am actually involved in a number of voting rights cases now, and had to message a legal team yesterday about the concern was, will newly naturalized citizens be encounter trouble or discrimination at the polls? And I said, my concern is that they won't even go to the polls, because in Louisiana we don't have ice in the streets widely yet, but there have been some. We have had some high profile people taken away, and a U.S. senator and a congressman were able to intervene to get them back. So that got a lot of news. And of course, we have so many detention centers in our state that specter is much more real to people, and that's the fear itself can be perhaps the most massive violation. There was a question early on that was directed to Liz, but I think it actually, Laura may have something to say about this too. What has been the response of religious advocacy groups to the rising religious nationalism that has been invoked by religious conservatives in the Trump administration to support the repression of immigrants, aliens? Liz or Laura? I mean, Laura, are your people in Nebraska talking about nationalism? Is that a Christian nationalism? Is that a concern?
I don't know that the specific group that I talked about has used the term religious nationalism, and it's likely because they are trying to advocate for immigrants and sort of avoid some of the flashpoints of
Mhm.
conversation that might cause, extra debate, let's say, or even kind of shut down conversation. But I do think it's been, I mean, again, touch off of this and hopefully answer the question. But I just like a week ago finished an article about the role of both race and religion in immigration enforcement. Dr. Elrod, this is very, I heard you talking about this in the first 5 minutes of your presentation. And what I was trying to work on was treatment of Christians specifically, actually. I said in the paper and I say now, I don't think Christians should be treated differently or better than anyone else in our immigration system. But it's really interesting when you have kind of a narrative around protecting Christians from persecution or kind of helping Christians, giving them power. And then when you have an immigration system which is refusing Christian refugees, or some of the big cases there have been Iranian Christian immigrants who were persecuted partly for their religion in the country of Iran. trying to get to the United States and being flown to Panama to be, I mean, Liz, you're nodding and you may know the case, but I don't know what has happened to those folks after they got taken to Panama. So it's sort of fascinating sort of who counts as a Christian who needs to be protected. And again, Brian, I think, to what you were saying, there's a lot going on there in terms of how we perceive people's religious affiliation in conjunction with their race. Who counts as a proper Christian who might deserve protection within our system. So, Christy, that's a roundabout way of talking about religious nationalism, that I think there's a sense in which nationalism can't be separated from religion or race. You can't really fully separate those out. But I do think, to answer a little more directly, there has been a really interesting way, in my view, that different Christian groups have been talking about religious nationalism. And of course, folks who think that Christian nationalism is a good thing may or may not use the term. They'll just say, this is a Christian nation. They'll say, Christians are being protected. They'll talk about, how we need to bring God back and so on. And folks who don't think Christian nationalism is a good thing include some of the refugee resettlement organization and mission organizations from within evangelical Christian groups, who you might stereotypically expect to be, again, sort of conservative. I keep using kind of air quotes because I don't want to use these terms in unreflective ways, but you might expect some groups to be more supportive of strict refugee policies or strict deportation policies or whatever it might be. But in particular, the evangelical Christian groups that have been involved with global issues, mission, assistance to refugees, some of those groups have spoken and said, there are forms of Christian nationalism going on here. And as Christians, we don't like that. We think that that's actually undermining our Christian faith. So one of the interesting groups that I've started to kind of connect with a little bit is the Baptist Joint Commission or Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty, Religious Freedom. And probably most of you know them. And they have they get involved in court cases as well, but they just have a really interesting, clear way of talking about the importance to them. Many of the staff there having either a Baptist or a Christian background, and concerns about Christian nationalism undermining the Christian tradition within the U.S. as well as certain constitutional rights. So let me stop there, and I suspect our other panelists can add much more or correct me.
I see Liz is working that question and answer, typing those responses. Do you want to say anything about the one you typed in on the ones who are invoking nationalism?
No, it's funny. My response was just Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and Interfaith Alliance are really leading the charge, and they have a project called Christians Against Christian Nationalism that might be of interest.
Interesting. There was reference to Christian persecution, and I see we still have a question in the open questions about South Africa, interestingly, which now has this unique status where there is a preference in place for white South Africans, but someone is referencing this the South African context and saying to all presenters, what would you advise other groups? And another question came in that bumped mine up. What would you advise jurisdictions on fighting against xenophobia, like what is happening in countries such as South Africa, where vigilante movements prevent immigrants from accessing basic human rights like healthcare services, education, and employment? I don't know that we've seen vigilante groups here yet in the US, have we? I mean, that would be unless you consider what ICE is developing to be a quasi vigilante group.
I'll say I have heard reports of faith groups being surveilled and targeted by vigilante groups, border groups, and things like that, and people being afraid, for example, to start giving out know your rights materials in certain areas, not just because of what ICE is doing, but because of armed people and know your, in open carry states kind of lurking around and watching them. So
Yeah.
I don't know that that's not really particularly helpful advice, but Brian, I want to let you speak.
Oh, well, I think similar. I would tag on, certainly in the borderlands, I can think of organizations like the militiamen, who are in fact these armed vigilante groups who are sort of out walking the migrant trails, and sort of doing their own kind of immigration enforcement. Now, I think that's a strange sort of thing, right? And that it also actually undermines the legitimacy of the thing they mean to support. And that is they sort of fracture where legitimate authority may lie. I don't know a lot though about these vigilante groups I think are out there, but I actually don't know a lot about how they interact, say, with organizations like the Samaritans or No Mas Muertes, whether they're kind of in the same territory, but and I'm sure speaking about each other, but avoiding each other, or to what extent, like Liz is saying, there's sort of active surveillance going on. Um, so I'm not sure that I've got any advice on what ought to be done there.
Yeah, well, something to look out for. There's a kind of related question in my mind. How can the US ensure that its immigration policies and practices are informed by evidence-based research and data? I mean, just in the political rhetoric, there's all of the stuff about immigrants are taking our healthcare services, they're getting this and that, and much of this is not borne out in actual policy. Is there a dearth of evidence? That it exists or is not being communicated to the public. I mean, I think some of the statistics, and I think Laura pointed this out in her essay about the economic contributions that immigrants make are pretty persuasive. They actually pay into systems that they will never get a benefit from until they're naturalized.
Yeah, and in our case, it's even, as you know, Chrissy, too, often the federal government benefits financially from immigrants who pay taxes and so on. In state and localities, it's a little more, it's not, it's more of a question of whether they take in money. But in our case, I mean, we're an agricultural state. We just don't have people to do the jobs, and our corn and soybean and meatpacking businesses cannot run without workers. So it's the private sector that's really been emphasizing that. But it's when I saw that question too, and I think the question was something like, how could we make sure that policy is made on data? And I was like, oh man, I don't know. The data's out there, I think. I mean, there's good data. I see nods. So I don't think it's a question of whether the data exists. It's really I also just typed an answer to a question about, religious groups only have so much power in these areas. They don't have as much, in my view, political power as some. I think the best that religious groups and others can do is to keep kind of chipping away at trying to change narratives and try to emphasize the importance of, for all of us, not maybe believing the very first thing you hear, maybe thinking a little bit about how does this comport with other things, maybe just having some conversations. It's one of those questions, it's such a good question, and it's almost impossible to answer because there's so many factors that tend to kind of push against sometimes making policy based on data. And yet you have to keep trying. So I don't have a good answer to it. I think my answer is just you have to keep trying. Oh, sorry, Brian, but before I saw that you unmuted. There's a good book written by Hein Haas, who is a European scholar, and it's called something like, it's not quite What's Real About Migration. If I can find it on my shelf, I'll find the title. But it's a thick book, but it has chapters that you can read one by one. You could send a chapter to somebody you know, and it's literally just what is going on. It tries to be as calm as it possibly can be about talking about the data in an accessible way. And I kind of call it the "You Need to Calm Down" book about migration. So for folks who are open to looking at migration as an issue that maybe you just haven't thought about, the role of migrants in healthcare, or, are migrant workers going to save us from our falling birth rates? The answer is actually no, but there's some interesting data around that. It's a really good book. I'll see if I can find the information from the chat. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Laura, if you can actually find a link to it, that would be wonderful to put in
Okay.
the chat. And if you can't get it in, I or John will post it for you. But I'm looking at some of the questions that some of you have answered. Laura typed an answer to this. There was a question: are migration issues not beyond the current capacity of religious organizations in the U.S.? Do they have the capacity to mount pressure on state actors? How much of a pressure game, an influence game, are religions running these days, or should they run? Brian.
This is, I think, the question that I'm anxious about, as I say at the top of at the top of my talk, and I try to take on in my book. I think in some respects I'm not optimistic, and so I think in the title of my paper I talk about insular constitutionalism as opposed to redemptive constitutionalism. So cover thinks of redemptive constitutionalism as an effort to use sort of the Constitution in order to bring about large-scale change. And I think with the person who posed that question, I doubt whether religious organizations actually have um, the the capacity to achieve that kind of change. Insular constitutionalism, I think, describes an effort to utilize constitutional defenses. So here it's functioning more like a shield, less like a sword, to create sort of pockets where alternative forms of community can, if not, practice, can be anticipated. I'm more confident about churches, religious organizations' abilities to do that, but I'm really curious what Liz, given the work that you've just been doing, if you're a more optimistic person than I am, or if I'm
Yeah, how are your plaintiffs holding up? How are they?
Oh, I'll clarify. None of I don't litigate, so they're not my
Oh, okay.
plaintiffs. Um,
And the plaintiffs in the cases you study.
yeah. So, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it works. It's a really good fit for the way RIFRA works, right? Which is, if you think about kind of a free exercise type argument versus an establishment type argument, establishment clause um, is saying that this kind of violates the way church and state are meant to interact, and therefore the whole law or whatever has to be struck down and it's gone for everybody. RIFRA is much more of that kind of insular, like you were describing. It's saying we're not challenging the law, we're not challenging the harboring statute, we're not challenging the government's right to deport people generally, whatever have you. It's carving out saying that that can't be enforced on us because it violates our religious liberty. And so I think that that kind of analysis is a good fit for what they're trying to do. I mean, yeah, I don't know that I would say I'm in an optimistic place. I'm kind of in a spaghetti at the wall place of like, let's just try things and see what, if anything, sticks. And I think like we're a lot of the things that we're seeing religious communities try to do, it's working sometimes and it's not working sometimes. So things like accompaniment, right? Accompanying undocumented people to their court hearings in a collar, to be a witness and to be a person in the room watching. We've had reports that where that has seemed to have a positive effect on having people be able to leave and not get detained and leave that hearing. And then we've heard reports where other judges, other locations, other institutions where we just had in New York, we just had a bunch of religious leaders arrested outside 26 Federal Plaza, which is our immigration court here. And so I think most people are not looking for a quick fix right now. They're looking at building community and really engaging creatively in a bunch of long-term strategies, building community and yeah, trying to kind of figure out ways to protect their neighbors, protect their communities, rather than saying like, we're gonna change the immigration system anytime in the next few years.
Can I sneak one more thought in there? I'm sorry, this
Absolutely.
part of what Liz was sharing has me thinking about this. I think one of the problems that occupies me, right, is that even in successes like the No More Deaths cases, what's being protected is not the migrant per se, but rather it's actually the citizens' rights, and this may produce again a kind of shield. But that all that manages to do is kind of create a measure of interstitial space wherein these different ways of understanding the relationship between the citizen and the migrant can be practiced. But I think that sort of full scale change, part of what would have to happen is, at least as I see it as a non-lawyer, is that we would have to see a fundamental change in what we understand aliens to be. Like right now, that's a legal figure that is, I think, distinctly exposed and precarious to exclusion and removal, and that a character that lacks, or a figure, pardon me, that lacks a number of the defenses that a citizen has, or even an alien would have in a criminal court, as opposed to a migration court. Here again, I'm looking for the folks with the JDs in the room to correct me. But overcoming that problem, I think, is immense. The early in the Biden administration, his new immigration legislation was supposed to strike the language of the alien from our legal language, but the bill went to committee early and disappeared and has not been heard from since, nor do I expect it will be. And so I think again, before we can have this kind of substantive change, we need not just to think about sort of the social capital or the political pressure that religious organizations, even at the large scale, can exert, but also the kind of what different legal frameworks afford what they actually protect and what they don't. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, and I'll say like we were very aware of that, and that's why we did want to start our report with the claims that made by migrants, saying like we actually also are protected by RFRA. So undocumented people are protected by RFRA and have made legal claims under it. They haven't gotten, most of them have not, well, I don't want to overbroad, but like there's nothing quite at the level of like the kind of attention that the No More Deaths case got, which you're right was about citizen humanitarian aid workers. But I'll say I mean, it can be used for migrants. And then I also say that like I do think it raises interesting questions about like the leverage and the level of protection that these kind of higher privileged people can have. Like I think of a recent case that was a RFRA case saying, ICE can't shoot at religious people engaged in religious activities outside of detention centers. A huge win. Yeah, you can't shoot at them. But it was initially successful. And, to the extent that that can then protect people around them, because maybe if you have these people, engaged in physical protection of others, you can think about ways to say like, yes, it's not the greatest one in the world, but maybe we can leverage it to protect a broader number of people. And I'm sorry.
I have exercised my prerogative as moderator to raise my own hand because we're coming to the end of our hour and 15 minutes, and I need to make some express some thanks. First of all, to my JLR colleague, executive editor Silas Allard, who was really the intellectual emphasis behind this. To Rachel Orbetta, our wonderful managing editor at Canopy Forum, who is played a huge role in collaborating this and putting together all the essays. And to John Burnell, our digital director and intrepid webinar coordinator. We do have essays. All three of you have submitted them. They will be coming out over the next week and a half or so at canopyforum.org. There were also 3 essays that were not presented today. Their presenters could not join us, but we will have an essay from Don Kerwin on Catholic social thought and immigration policies, another from Ulrich Schmeidel and Diane von den Bosch at Lund University in Sweden, a Rawlsian analysis of migration issues in the European Union. And finally, at the end, we'll have one from Elizabeth Shackman-Hurd, wonderful political scientist of religion at Northwestern, on No Kings, Plenitudo Potestas, and the sanctity of U.S. national security. So someone asked about national security. There will be an essay on that. So with that, thanks again to our wonderful panelists and to all of you for attending and submitting your good questions. We'll have another webinar coming up November 14th on the Johnson Amendment and religious exemptions and permission to endorse political candidates. So look for the announcements on that.